Hi, I'm Leo from the Minnesota Medievalist, and today we're going to be talking about women in combat sports. I was online and I saw a lot of videos talking about women in combat sports and women fighting in general, but almost all these videos were by men and really only featured men. And so I thought, I know a couple women who are in combat sports and fight people. Wouldn't it be interesting to hear their thoughts? So we're just going to go and have you introduce yourselves and kind of talk about what you do.
Alright, so I'm Lizzie. I have been doing Historical European Martial Arts, or HEMO for short, with Leo for 3 years. And what HEMA is in the 20th century, these medieval texts about fencing began resurfacing, and so some folks decided to look at these treatises and what they're saying about how they used to fence in the medieval times, and we've been learning those techniques just like they really would have. So the sport we mainly do is longsword. We have a longsword right here.
Very cool. I'm Gillian. I did Olympic saber fencing for about 7 years. Olympic fencing has 3 different categories. There's épée, foil, and saber. Obviously, I did saber. Olympic fencing is a little bit different than historical fencing because it's a lot more watered down. It sort of originates during the time period where dueling, particularly to the death, started becoming outlawed, so people started dueling to the first blood instead. So that sort of idea of fighting to the first blood started becoming like a sport practice. So then you have like épée, where the whole body is the target, and then foil became the sort of practice weapon for épée, which is where only the chest is the target. And what I did was saber, and saber is more sort of derived from cavalry, where the target is just waist up and not including the hands. An important component of saber is the rules of right-of-way, so determining who gets the point, sort of when both people hit, is a very important component that doesn't really exist in historical fencing. And yeah, I've also been doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for a little bit over a year now, and I've just gotten my blue belt, which is really cool, but I'm a little bit less of an expert on Jiu-Jitsu. But Jiu-Jitsu is essentially, the way that I describe it to people is like wrestling, except there are submissions, so there's arm bars, there's chokes, there's leg locks. So yeah, the idea is you're physically grabbing your opponent and taking them to the ground and submitting them from there.
Lizzie, what does it mean to you to be a woman who fences HEMA, like physically?
Well, the first distinction I should make is that in HEMA we are usually fencing all genders. So in tournaments there are sometimes when there will be sections just for women, but in the greater bouting pools, those are men and women. So the thing about swords is that swords kind of level the playing field. They don't really rely on strength all that much, especially the type of sport that we do. So, I mean, women win national competitions like frequently. It isn't that big of a difference. Even like differences between like really strong people and weaker people. Like as long as you know how to use your body mechanics to your advantage, you can really achieve a high skill level. So it's really a lot more about skill than it is about strength. If you're trained a lot and you know how to use your body.
Yeah, and Gillian, have you had a similar experience, or how does that come into play in fencing, Olympic fencing, and in Jiu-Jitsu?
Yeah, so first off, in both in Olympic fencing and in Jiu-Jitsu, there is a little bit of a distinction in terms of who you're competing. So if you compete at a fairly high level in fencing, you're only going to be competing people of your own gender. So I only fenced against women, particularly on the national level. Once you get to a local level and there's not a whole lot of people competing, then they kind of mix people together, but usually the rule of thumb is that it's like men's saber and women's saber, and those two categories are kind of segregated. And it also goes for jiu-jitsu as well. Like this is even more of a harder rule in jiu-jitsu, where the men are only grappling with the men and the women are only grappling with women, and they also have weight categories. So like, I fight at 125 and you have to make weight before you fight, and if you're overweight, or if you're overweight including a pound allowance, then you just don't get to fight the people in your weight class and you're just kind of done. So there is a pretty good distinction there. At least with fencing, I'm definitely on the same page as Lizzie that it really does just boil down to someone's skill and how well they're able to manipulate the distance and the timing, because especially with Olympic fencing, the rules are just designed in such a way that strength really is not a factor really at all in terms of whether you win or lose the fight, because it takes, like, all you have to do is touch the person with your sword and that's count as a hit. So it really comes down to whether or not you're able to hit and not get hit, and that's the most important factor, at least in fencing. But with jiu-jitsu, even though technique is such an important part of it, strength, it was such a shock for me to go from strength being such a non-factor to strength being such a huge factor in anybody that you roll with. And that has definitely come into play, like who I can roll with, and when I'm competing, the type of people that I am rolling with, and it's a lot less diverse than the types of people that I was fencing with, for sure. I'm a lot more confined as a woman, but with jiu-jitsu, I have to be almost careful with who I roll with, because it's so easy for me to get hurt with someone who doesn't know how important strength is when they're rolling with someone. And so I think that, particularly for me, physically as a woman, that's almost like you have to be careful. You have to be extra careful with who you roll with, because on average, and especially for me, I'm a small woman as well, so like women on average, I think they have to be much more guarded about who they roll with, specifically in jiu-jitsu, because strength has a much higher potential to cause like injury, as well as influence like where things are going, even if your technique is still fairly strong. So yeah.
And that kind of leads us nicely into our next section, talking about like what does it mean socially and kind of environment-wise to be a woman in combat sports. Lizzie, would you like to talk a little bit just about like how is it socially different to be a woman in a combat sport?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on who you're fencing. People's attitudes really make a big difference. We're lucky enough to be in like a really progressive environment, so there are very few problematic people and problematic men there. But yeah, the biggest problems occur when people don't know their own strength, like Gillian was saying, and I've had issues with people who like feel like they need to prove themselves and prove that they're like the strongest, because they may have insecurities about that. So they'll be like faster and more aggressive and hit harder, which actually doesn't make a difference in like actually winning touches. It doesn't matter how hard you hit, but it can hurt, and it can be difficult dealing with people's attitudes like that. And then the other thing about HEMA is that it's, as you may expect, a very, very male-dominated sport. So, oftentimes, like, it's been getting a lot better over the years, but I will still find that I'm the only woman in the gym on occasion, and so I know that's something that I notice pretty often, and I don't know if anybody else notices that, so I can feel a little bit alone in those kinds of situations. And there are also, I know some people can feel uncomfortable being in an environment where it's mostly men. I'm not generally one of those people, but like that can get uncomfortable for some people, and so we actually have this class at our club called the Them Fatale class, which is supposed to be a safe space for women, trans, femme, and non-binary fencers, and that has really helped us to create like a very inclusive club culture.
Gillian, would you like to tell us like a little bit about kind of the evolution of combat and how that changes the importance of strength and size for the fighter?
Yeah, so one thing I've noticed, and this can, I think, sort of go historically, but also just in terms of the modern day, in terms of what sort of flavor of martial art that you're doing, like, strength has importance in varying degrees depending on what sort of tools that you have at your disposal. So, like, of course, in the very beginning of human history, all you have is, like, your hands and your body and, like, maybe your clothes, maybe. And in that situation, like, being the smaller guy, when you have nothing but your body and maybe your clothes, like, being the smaller guy is a really incredible disadvantage, because if, you know, this big person has every single opportunity and all of the means to completely dominate and leverage that strength over you in a way that's going to make it a lot more difficult to win that physical altercation. But then as you start bringing in tools, you, like, you know, a rock, a stick, a knife, a sword, like, you have more and more opportunities for that smaller person to utilize that tool in a way that prevents the bigger person from being able to leverage their strength over you in a way that, like, really makes it difficult for you to win. And so you see that throughout history, and you see that now in sort of the different martial arts. So with fencing, like, it was the extreme end of that opposite spectrum, for me anyway, in terms of, like, strength was such a non-factor, because not only did we have, like, pointy sticks to stop you and keep distance away so that you can't physically grab someone, but also the rules are designed in such a way that, in terms of the incentive that you have to win the game, it just completely pushes you away from strength in almost any way whatsoever. In fencing, really, the only advantage that you have as a bigger person might be in terms of your leg length and your arm length and how far you can hit someone. But, you know, you start getting into things like, you go from, like, bows and arrows and swords more into, like, the gun territory. Like, now you've reached a situation where, like, if you're a massive dude going up against a tiny guy with a gun, like, you're gonna lose that fight, because you don't need to be strong really at all to fire a gun. And so I think that is also a really important component when you're talking about martial arts, is like, okay, well, what kind of martial arts are we talking about? What kind of tools do we have at our disposal? And that in and of itself is going to influence sort of the importance of strength in this situation, because when you have a sword, you have that distance and you have this incentive to keep this person away, otherwise you're going to kill them. But when it comes to grappling, like, you don't have that sort of protection. You have to use your body, and that becomes a sort of art form in and of itself, knowing how to use your body, and that's when you have to really be comfortable with that technique, and that is sort of a skill set in and of itself. But I think that is an important conversation to be had when you're talking about martial arts, or you're talking about, like, historically, including women in the conversation. It's like, well, okay, are we talking about fist fights? Are we talking about rock fights? Are we talking about, like, gun fights? Because, like, you know, particularly with guns, like, there's a reason why there's this heinous pattern of armies recruiting children into their militaries, because while you really don't need to be that big and strong to shoot a gun, and so the more guns you have against people without guns, it turns into statistics at that point. But yeah, for sure. And
I think really that technique can be equally as much of a, like, playing field leveler as a tool is. You know, in HEMA, in some treatises, they talk about the buffalo, somebody who's just trying to use their strength solely to win, and then they provide the technique to stop that, you know, when you are set upon by a brute, you know, and so on. And so I think that's really interesting, and also kind of talking about the history of women and just people in general who are less strong fighting. There's, you know, many examples, and there's not many direct textual examples, particularly in the period I focus on, for women fighting directly with swords, but there is a surprising amount of visual examples, and which suggests to me that this idea is at least not as foreign to medieval and early modern society as we often like to think about. And there is some very compelling textual examples. One that comes to mind particularly is the example of Walpurgis in the
MSI 33.
MSI 33, thank you very much, Lizzie. I know, I always mixed up with those numbers, but the Sword and Buckler manuscript, which is in fact one of the earliest manuscripts that is used to fence HEMA, and in it there are women, or all women, learning to fight sword and buckler, and even teaching, I'm pretty sure, the sword and buckler. And so this is something, to me, that has clearly been going on for a long time, and weapons and techniques are just a leveler, and we can see that today in modern combat sports. Even if it's more difficult for people who are smaller and weaker to win, if they have the correct training and the correct tools, they still can. Well, I think that'll be the conclusion of our discussion today. Thank you both very much for joining me to talk about this really interesting topic. And hopefully we'll be back soon with some more interesting, tangentially medieval discussion.
Thank you, Leo.
Thanks, Leo.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Say something, Lizzie. Say something insightful.
Something insightful.
There was a merry messenger, a passenger, a mariner. He built a gilded gondola to wander in, and had in her a load of yellow oranges and porridge for his provender.
All right, perfect.
Very good. Very nice.
All right. Lizzie, what does it mean to you to, like, physically be a woman who fences HEMA?
Maybe you should ask that a little differently. Maybe you should put the physically at the end.
Alright. Lizzie, what does it mean to you? Sorry.
Oh my god.
Sorry, now I'm just thinking about what I said. Okay. Alright.
See, the trick is I'm actually leaning on it because otherwise it's going to keep falling.
It may just seem cool, but it's actually practical.
That can go in the blooper reel.
Yeah. Oh my god.